The evening air was heavy with tension as Michael stood under the dim streetlight, his eyes reflecting a mix of hope and desperation. Isabella's face was unreadable, her arms crossed as if creating a barrier between them. "I can't do this, Michael," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of her decision. His heart pounded in his chest, refusing to accept what he was hearing. "Isabella, please. Just give me more time," he pleaded, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "I'm working so hard, I promise things will change." She looked away, her eyes glistening as she tried to hide her emotions. "It's not just about time, Michael. It's about security, stability. I can't live in uncertainty." He took a step closer, but she instinctively stepped back, creating a painful distance between them. "But I love you," he whispered, the words almost breaking as they left his lips. "Isn't that enough?" A tear escaped her eye as she finally met his gaze. "Sometimes, love isn't enough," she said, her voice barely audible. The words sliced through Michael's heart like a knife, leaving a hollow ache that echoed through his entire being. His dreams of building a life with her crumbled before his eyes. She turned to leave, but he grabbed her hand, his grip gentle yet desperate. "Please, Isabella. Don't do this," he murmured, his voice trembling. For a moment she hesitated, her heart waging a silent battle between what she wanted and what she thought she needed. But then, she pulled her hand away, her decision final. "Goodbye, Michael," she whispered, walking away without looking back. Michael stood frozen, watching her disappear into the night, each step she took echoing the finality of her decision. His world had just shattered, and he felt powerless to stop it. Days turned into weeks, but the pain didn't fade. Michael buried himself in work, using his broken heart as fuel to push harder, determined to prove that he was more than the man she had walked away from. Late nights and early mornings became his routine, his mind replaying the moment she left him every time he closed his eyes. He drowned himself in ambition, vowing silently that one day he would become a man she could never reject. Meanwhile, Isabella tried to convince herself she had made the right choice. Her friends and family reassured her that choosing stability over love was the practical decision. She was now dating a man who had everything Michael couldn't offer: wealth, connections, and a secure future. But despite the luxury that surrounded her, her heart felt emptier with each passing day. She smiled at the fancy dinners and wore expensive dresses, but deep down, an unsettling void gnawed at her. Memories of Michael haunted her, reminding her of the simple happiness they once shared. Michael's life, however, was transforming in ways neither of them could have imagined. He had poured his pain into building a business that was now gaining attention in the corporate world. His relentless dedication, sleepless nights, and sacrifices were paying off. The man who once stood under that dim streetlight with shattered dreams was now on the brink of unimaginable success. Yet, despite his achievements, his heart still carried the weight of her rejection. He had become a man of power and influence, but the void Isabella left behind remained unfilled. His success felt hollow without her by his side, but he had learned to mask his pain behind a facade of confidence and charm. As fate would have it, their paths were destined to cross again. But this time, it wouldn't be as the heartbroken man begging for her love. It would be as a man who had everything she once craved, but was she ready to face the consequences of her choice? Isabella was about to discover that walking away from love had a price, and Michael was no longer the same man she had rejected. The stage was set for a reunion where the tables would be turned, and the man she once left behind would return in a way she never expected. The question lingered. Would she regret her decision, or was it already too late? The journey was just beginning, and their lives were about to collide once more. But this time, everything had changed. Isabella was living the life she had always dreamed of, or at least that's what she kept telling herself. Dressed in designer clothes and attending lavish galas, she was now engaged to Daniel Whitmore, a wealthy businessman whose family name opened doors to a world of privilege and power. Her days were filled with shopping sprees, spa appointments, and glamorous events where she was always the center of attention. To everyone around her, She was the epitome of success. Beautiful, engaged to a rich man, and living a life many envied. But behind the perfect smile and sparkling diamond ring, Isabella felt a growing emptiness gnawing at her heart. Daniel was everything she thought she wanted: handsome, charming, and capable of giving her the life she had always dreamed of. He showered her with gifts and affection, making sure she had everything her heart desired. Yet despite the glamorous life, something was missing. Late at night, when the world was silent and her thoughts echoed louder, her mind drifted back to Michael. She tried to push away the memories, but they refused to fade. The way he used to look at her with genuine love, the way his laughter filled the air with warmth, and the way he made her feel safe even when the world was uncertain. Those moments haunted her. Daniel was perfect on paper, but he lacked the depth and sincerity that Michael had given her effortlessly. Conversations with Daniel felt shallow, revolving around business deals, high society gossip, and luxury vacations. There was no passion, no vulnerability, no raw emotion that made her feel truly connected. She felt like a trophy, displayed for the world to admire but never truly seen for who she was. Daniel noticed her distant gaze one evening during a charity gala. "Isabella, is everything all right?" he asked, his tone filled with concern but lacking the warmth she craved. She forced a smile, brushing away her thoughts. "Of course, Daniel. I'm just a little tired." But her eyes betrayed her, reflecting the turmoil she couldn't voice. Deep down, she knew she wasn't just tired. She was emotionally exhausted from pretending to be happy. As days turned into weeks, the void within her grew, and she began to question her choices. She had sacrificed love for security. But was it worth it? Daniel could offer her everything except the one thing her heart truly desired: genuine love. Michael's absence was a constant reminder of the price she had paid for choosing stability over passion. One afternoon, while Daniel was away on a business trip, Isabella found herself walking through the park where she and Michael used to spend hours talking about their dreams. The memories hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her breathless. She sat on the same bench where they had once laughed and planned a future that now seemed like a distant memory. Her mind wandered to the day she had left Michael, choosing a life of luxury over a life of uncertainty. Her heart ached as she realized that despite all her wealth, she had never felt as alive as she did when she was with him. As she stared at the horizon, lost in her thoughts, she whispered to herself, "Why does it feel like I'm losing something I never truly let go of?" Isabella's world was perfect on the surface, but the cracks were starting to show. Her heart was caught between the life she thought she wanted and the love she had left behind. But fate had a way of making people confront their past, and Isabella was about to discover that no amount of luxury could fill the void left by a love that was real. The perfect life she had built was beginning to feel like a gilded cage, and the key to her happiness was locked in a past she had tried to forget. But was it too late to find her way back to what truly mattered? Michael had disappeared from Isabella's life after that heartbreaking day when she chose wealth over love. But while she was busy living a life of luxury, Michael was silently fighting a battle that no one saw. Heartbroken and humiliated, he left the small town where he had spent his entire life, determined to prove to himself, and maybe even to her, that he was more than just a struggling dreamer. His journey was anything but easy. With nothing but a few dollars in his pocket and a heart full of determination, Michael moved to the city, ready to chase the dreams he had once shared with Isabella. The memories of her rejection fueled his desire to succeed. He didn't want to win her back. At least, that's what he told himself. He wanted to prove that he was capable of becoming the man she had wished he could be. But success didn't come overnight. Michael worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs to keep himself afloat. During the day, he delivered packages, and at night, he worked as a bartender to make ends meet. In between, he spent every spare moment learning about business, reading books, watching online courses, and studying the lives of successful entrepreneurs. His days were long, and his nights were even longer, but giving up was never an option. He was fueled by a burning desire to transform his life. Not just for himself, but to prove that he was worth more than the label Isabella had placed on him. Every setback pushed him harder. When he was rejected by investors who didn't believe in his ideas, he refined his pitch. When he ran out of money, he found another way to keep going. His resilience was tested at every turn, but he refused to let failure define him. Michael's break came when he stumbled upon an opportunity in the tech world. He had an idea for an innovative app that could revolutionize how small businesses connected with customers. But to make it a reality, he needed funding, something that seemed impossible at the time. Determined not to give up, Michael entered startup competitions, hoping that someone would see the potential in his vision. After countless sleepless nights and hundreds of rejections, he finally caught the attention of a venture capitalist who believed in him. That one yes changed everything. With the funding secured, Michael threw himself into building his dream. He surrounded himself with a team that shared his passion and worked tirelessly to turn his idea into a reality. The road to success was still filled with challenges, but Michael had learned how to navigate them with unwavering determination. Years passed, and Michael's startup grew beyond anything he had ever imagined. What started as a small idea turned into a multi-million-dollar company, with offices in multiple cities and clients from all over the world. But despite his success, Michael remained humble. He had never forgotten where he came from, or the struggles that had shaped him. Yet, even as he stood at the top of the world, something was missing. The success he had dreamed of was now his reality, but the emptiness in his heart reminded him of the love he had lost. Michael had everything he had once wished for: wealth, power, and respect. But he couldn't shake the feeling that none of it mattered without someone to share it with. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he still thought about Isabella. He wondered if she was truly happy, if her life had turned out the way she had envisioned. And despite everything, a part of him still wished that she could see the man he had become. But Michael wasn't the same man who had begged her to choose love over wealth. He was stronger now, more confident, and no longer defined by the opinions of others. He had built an empire from the ground up, and his success was a testament to his resilience. Yet deep down, he knew that the greatest battle he had ever fought was not against the world. It was against the emptiness in his heart. Michael had conquered the world, but was it enough to fill the void left by the woman who had once walked away? Life had a strange way of bringing people back to where they belonged, and Michael's journey was far from over. The man who had been humiliated for being poor was now a powerful force, but fate had one more twist in store, one that would bring him face to face with the woman who had once broken his heart. And this time, the power would be in his hands. Michael's transformation was something that no one, not even he, could have imagined when he had first set foot in the city, broken-hearted and empty-handed. The journey that took him from a struggling, rejected man to the pinnacle of success was not just about financial gain. It was about personal growth, resilience, and the unshakable belief that he was capable of something more. The early years were full of pain and disappointment. He lived in cramped apartments, often skipping meals to make rent. The memories of Isabella's rejection haunted him daily, reminding him of the man he once was, the man she had deemed unworthy of her love. But Michael was not the kind of person to dwell in the past. He was driven by a singular purpose: to build a life that would prove to her, and to the world, that he was worth something more than the man she had dismissed. He started small. Working odd jobs during the day and hustling at night, Michael spent every waking moment trying to climb out of the financial hole he had found himself in. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, not even Isabella, but he knew that the only way to change his circumstances was through hard work and persistence. He believed that with every setback, he was one step closer to his dream. But success didn't come easily, and there were times when he felt like giving up. There were weeks when he had to sleep in his office just to save money. There were months when he couldn't pay his bills, yet somehow managed to scrape by. Still, he pressed on. His breakthrough came when he started to apply what he had learned during his sleepless nights studying business and technology. One idea led to another, and soon he had created a product, a new software tool that could change the way businesses handled customer relationships. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. His passion fueled his vision, and the determination that had once been driven by rejection now became the driving force behind his success. Michael sought out investors, and despite the many rejections, he continued to refine his pitch. It was during a pivotal meeting with an angel investor that things began to change. The investor, a self-made millionaire, saw potential in Michael and decided to take a chance on him. That moment was the catalyst for everything that came after. With the investment in hand, Michael threw himself into developing his product, expanding his vision, and building his company. He was no longer just a dreamer. He was a man on a mission. As his business grew, so did his confidence. Michael surrounded himself with brilliant minds, hiring the best talent he could find, and together they created something truly remarkable. His startup skyrocketed, becoming a leader in its field. With every deal, every partnership, and every new success, Michael's empire expanded. He went from a man who had to borrow money to pay for food, to someone who owned multi-million-dollar properties and controlled a global network of companies. But it wasn't just the money and success that changed him. Michael's entire outlook on life shifted. He had become the man he had always dreamed of being, not because of the wealth, but because of the strength he had gained from his journey. He had learned to believe in himself, to trust his instincts, and to take risks. His past failures no longer defined him. They had only been stepping stones that led him to his current success. Despite his transformation, there was still one thing that remained: an unfulfilled longing for Isabella. As his wealth grew, so did the memories of the woman who had once walked away from him, believing that money was the only thing that mattered. Michael's success was bittersweet. He had everything he could ever want: luxury cars, a beautiful mansion, a successful company. But the one thing he didn't have was her. Michael had become someone unrecognizable, even to himself. The once humble, shy man had turned into a confident, powerful entrepreneur with the world at his feet. He had done what he set out to do, prove that he was worth something more. But there was still something missing in his heart. His transformation was complete, yet he was left with a question that lingered in his mind. Was all of this success enough to fill the emptiness that only Isabella's love could have? The transformation from rags to riches had changed Michael's life beyond imagination. But as he stood on top of the world, he realized that sometimes the greatest riches are not measured in money, but in the relationships we build and the love we give. The air was thick with anticipation as Michael entered the upscale restaurant, his presence commanding attention. He had spent years building his empire, but tonight was different. This event wasn't about business deals or new partnerships. It was about something much more personal, an unexpected encounter that would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew. The evening had been carefully planned. Michael had been invited as a special guest to a gala hosted by one of his old colleagues. The venue was filled with the city's elite, a place where the world's wealthiest mingled over fine wine and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Michael had no problem fitting in. After all, he was now a man of power and influence. But his mind wasn't focused on the people around him. His thoughts were far from the small talk and pleasantries of the evening. He had one thing on his mind: the possibility of encountering Isabella again. It had been years since their paths had crossed, and over the years, Michael had done his best to push the memories of her out of his mind. But there was something about the way her rejection had lingered in his heart that never allowed him to fully forget. He had built his empire, become successful beyond his wildest dreams. But there was a part of him that still longed for the closure he never got. As he made his way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with old friends and business partners, Michael's attention was suddenly pulled in another direction. His heart skipped a beat when he saw her, Isabella. She stood across the room, her elegance unmistakable, yet there was something different about her. The years had changed them both in ways they could never have anticipated. The girl who had once rejected him was now a woman who appeared just as flawless as ever. her beauty only heightened by the grace of time. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Michael's breath caught in his throat, and every sound around him faded into the background. There she was, the woman who had walked away from him, the woman whose rejection had sparked his transformation. The same woman who had once believed he was nothing more than a broke, hopeless man. Yet here she was, standing in front of him, looking as stunning and unreachable as ever. But Isabella didn't notice him right away. She was deep in conversation with a group of people, unaware that her past was standing just a few feet away. Michael hesitated. It had been so long. Was it worth approaching her? What would he say? Was he still that same man she had turned away? Or was he someone new now? As if guided by an invisible force, Michael took a few steps forward, his heart racing. He knew this was the moment, his chance to face the woman who had shaped so much of his life, the one who had unknowingly pushed him toward greatness. It wasn't about proving anything to her anymore. It was about seeing her again, understanding what had happened, and finding the closure he had been searching for. As he drew closer, Isabella finally looked up, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for the briefest of moments, she seemed frozen in place, as if unsure whether she was dreaming. Michael could see the flicker of confusion and surprise in her eyes. She had changed, but so had he. The man standing before her now was no longer the same person she had dismissed all those years ago. He was someone entirely different, someone who had rebuilt himself from the ground up. "Michael?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the same voice he remembered, the one that had once called him out for being nothing more than a dreamer. But now, there was something in her tone that was different. There was curiosity, maybe even a hint of regret. "Isabella," Michael replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It was a word that carried years of unresolved feelings, anger, sadness, but also a sense of peace that had come with time. "It's been a long time." For a moment, the two of them just stood there, looking at each other as if trying to reconcile the past with the present. The years had changed them both, but the unspoken tension between them was still palpable. The awkwardness of their past, the sting of rejection was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But Michael knew that this encounter was different. It wasn't about proving anything to her or seeking revenge for the past. It was about understanding each other as they were now, not as the people they once were. "I didn't expect to see you here," Isabella said, her eyes scanning him up and down as if trying to assess who this new man before her truly was. I didn't even know you were in the city." Michael shrugged, his gaze not leaving hers. "I've been here for a while now. I've built a life." Isabella nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She took a step closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. "I can see that. You've changed a lot." Michael smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile that came from the knowledge of everything he had been through. "I had to change. It's the only way to survive." The silence between them stretched, and for the first time in years, Michael realized that he wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness that once consumed him had dissipated. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that success wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about proving to yourself that you were capable of more than you ever imagined. "So," Isabella said, breaking the silence, "what brings you here tonight?" Michael paused. He could have said 1,000 things. He could have talked about his company, his success, or how far he had come. But instead, he chose honesty. "I came to see you," he said simply. "To see how you were doing." Isabella's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, but then the walls went up again. "Why?" she asked, her voice slightly defensive. "What do you want from me, Michael?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know what he wanted from her. All these years, He had thought about this moment. But now that it was happening, he was unsure of the answer. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was forgiveness. Or maybe it was just the need to finally understand why she had rejected him. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I've moved on. I just wanted to know who you are now, and if you're still the person I thought you were." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Isabella stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke again. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed softly, almost to herself. "I've spent so much time focusing on what I want that I forgot what I really needed." The vulnerability in her words took Michael by surprise. This wasn't the same woman who had turned him away all those years ago. The pride and arrogance had faded, replaced by a quiet self-awareness. He realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new for both of them. As their worlds collided once more, the past was still there, but it didn't seem as important anymore. The future was uncertain, but Michael couldn't help but wonder if this was the second chance they both needed. Maybe, just maybe, their stories were far from over. The past few years had been a whirlwind for Isabella. She had spent her time chasing the life she thought she wanted, marrying a wealthy man, living in luxury, and attending high-profile events, but something always felt like it was missing. Under the surface of her seemingly perfect life, a gnawing emptiness lingered, a void that no amount of money or status could fill. Yet it wasn't until she came face to face with Michael once again that she realized what had truly been missing all along. As she stood there, listening to Michael speak, a rush of emotions flooded her heart. She had never imagined that they would meet again. Their paths had crossed years ago when she had walked away from him, choosing the safety and comfort of wealth over the uncertain future Michael had offered. She had seen him as nothing more than a dreamer, someone who couldn't provide the life she thought she deserved. She had chosen stability over love, convinced that financial security was all that mattered. But now, seeing him in front of her, successful, confident, and exuding an air of power and authority, Isabella realized just how wrong she had been. Michael had transformed into someone unrecognizable from the man she had once known. He no longer had the air of uncertainty that had surrounded him back then. He was commanding and composed, standing tall in a tailored suit that seemed to mold perfectly to his frame. There was an undeniable aura about him, an air of accomplishment and strength that Isabella could no longer ignore. She had rejected him for being poor, for thinking that his dreams weren't enough. But in that moment, she understood that he had become the very thing she had always wanted: successful, driven, and powerful. Isabella's mind raced as she tried to make sense of her feelings. She couldn't deny the regret that had begun to settle in her chest. The man she had dismissed as not good enough was now someone she could never replace, no matter how many expensive dinners or lavish gifts her current life offered. All those years spent with her wealthy husband felt hollow in comparison to the genuine connection she had once shared with Michael. Back then, she had been too blind to see it. She had wanted security, a life of luxury. But in choosing those things, she had sacrificed love, the kind of love that Michael had always offered. She watched him closely as he continued to speak, his words filling the air between them. But her thoughts were consumed with the past. The days when they had first met. The days when she had seen him as nothing more than a man with dreams. She remembered the look in his eyes when she had rejected him, the quiet hurt that had flashed across his face, and the anger that had followed when he left. She had believed that his lack of wealth was a barrier. But now, in the face of his success, it was clear that it was her own shallow perception that had been the true obstacle. Isabella had made so many mistakes in her life, but none weighed as heavily on her heart as this one. She had dismissed a man who was once her equal, someone who had seen the world in a way that no one else had. Someone who had believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. And now she was left with a feeling of loss that could never be repaired, a regret that would follow her for the rest of her life. The reality of the situation hit her with full force as she took in the man standing before her. Michael was no longer the poor, struggling guy she had once turned away. He was a man who had built his own empire, someone who had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. And Isabella could only stand there, silently wishing that she could turn back time and make a different choice. She had married for money, for status, thinking it would bring her happiness. But now, seeing Michael, the man who had always been there for her, the man who had truly cared for her, she realized the depth of her mistake. Her husband was wealthy, yes, but the connection they shared was nothing like what she had shared with Michael. Her current life, despite its opulence, felt empty. The realization stung. As she stood before him, she couldn't help but wonder. What would her life have been like if she had chosen differently? If she had stayed with Michael, supported him as he fought for his dreams? Would she have been happy? Would they have built something together? Something real? The possibilities seemed endless, and yet the reality was harsh. The chance she had thrown away could never be recaptured. Michael, sensing the shift in her energy, grew quiet. He had seen this look in her eyes before, the look of regret, of realizing something lost. He knew that she was grappling with her decision, but he had long since made peace with the past. He wasn't angry with her anymore. In fact, he pitied her. She had spent so many years chasing a life that seemed perfect from the outside but was hollow on the inside. He had no desire to make her feel guilty or shame her for her choices, but he couldn't deny that he was aware of the change in her demeanor. It was obvious now that she realized what she had lost. The pain in Isabella's chest deepened as she thought about the years that could have been. She had built a life with someone who didn't know her the way Michael had. Her husband didn't understand her dreams, didn't see the person she had once been, and didn't share the same vision for the future. He had bought her everything she wanted, but in the process, he had failed to truly see her. Michael had always seen her for who she was, not just for what she could bring to the table. And now, as the truth of what she had lost settled in, it was almost too much to bear. The guilt and regret she felt were unbearable, and for a fleeting moment Isabella wished she could go back and make things right. But time was a cruel thing, and she couldn't change the past. The person Michael had become was no longer the one she had left behind, and the person she had been was not the same either. They were both different now, shaped by their experiences and their choices. But even in the midst of her regret, Isabella knew one thing for certain. She could never undo what had been done. The only thing left for her to do now was to accept the consequences of her actions and learn from them. As Michael turned to leave, Isabella couldn't stop herself from calling out his name. "Michael," she said softly. He paused but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice tinged with regret. It was all she could offer, but she hoped it was enough. Michael didn't say anything, but he nodded slightly, acknowledging her apology. The past couldn't be rewritten, but maybe, just maybe, they could find peace with what had happened. As he walked away, Isabella couldn't help but wonder if there was still a chance, somewhere deep inside her, for forgiveness. Not just from Michael, but from herself as well. The engagement party was nothing short of magnificent. A luxurious ballroom bathed in golden light, shimmering chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings, guests dressed in their finest attire, laughter, and clinking glasses filling the air. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. But amid the opulence, Julia couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled in her chest. As she stood beside her fiancé, the man everyone thought was her perfect match, she felt a deep, gnawing sense of dissatisfaction that she couldn't put into words. Her fiancé, Henry, was everything a woman could want. He was handsome, successful, and came from a prestigious family with connections that opened doors to the finest things in life. He was everything Julia's parents had hoped for when they first introduced her to him. He was the epitome of security and success. He had the wealth, the charm, and the status that everyone admired. But as she looked around the room, filled with familiar faces, she felt a cold distance from them. They were all congratulating her, offering their best wishes for her and Henry's future together. But Julia felt like an outsider in her celebration. There was no joy in her smile, no excitement in her laughter. She was playing a role, and deep inside, she knew it. Every time Henry looked at her with those adoring eyes, telling her how lucky he was to have found someone like her, it made her feel like a fraud. She wasn't the woman he thought she was, and she wasn't sure if she could ever truly be that woman. The doubts that had started to creep into her mind months ago were now impossible to ignore. She couldn't help but wonder if this lavish engagement, this life of wealth and status, was everything it was cracked up to be. There was a piece of her heart that longed for something more, something real, the hidden truth. The truth was, Julia had never been in love with Henry. She respected him, of course, and admired his accomplishments. He treated her with kindness and generosity, but there was always something missing between them. They had never shared that spark, that deep emotional connection that she had always hoped for in a relationship. And now, here they were, on the eve of their engagement, surrounded by people who had no idea that Julia's heart wasn't in it. They were all so enamored by the idea of their union. Henry, the perfect catch, and Julia, the elegant bride-to-be. It was the stuff of fairy tales. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't her story. The day had come to an end, and the guests slowly trickled out of the ballroom, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts. As Henry kissed her cheek and whispered his love for her, Julia couldn't help but feel like she was drifting further away from the man who thought he knew her so well. Sitting by the window in her dressing room, Julia stared out at the city lights below. She had everything she ever wanted in terms of wealth, security, and prestige. She was about to marry a man who could give her the world, yet she felt more alone than ever. She couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself. In that moment, Julia realized that she had been living for everyone else's expectations, not her own. She had let herself be swept away by the allure of wealth and status, blinded by the idea of perfection. She had allowed herself to believe that this life was enough, that it would bring her the happiness she had been searching for. But the reality was different. The more she tried to fit into this world, the more she felt like a stranger to herself. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard a knock at the door. It was her best friend, Emma, who had been with her through everything. Emma entered with a warm smile, but it quickly faded as she noticed Julia's distant expression. "What's wrong, Jules?" Emma asked softly, taking a seat next to her. Julia shook her head, forcing a smile. "Nothing, I don't know. I'm fine." Emma raised an eyebrow. "You don't look fine. You've been acting weird for weeks. Are you sure about this?" Julia let out a deep breath. She had been hiding her feelings for so long, keeping up the facade for everyone around her. But now, in the quiet of her room, with Emma by her side, she couldn't hide it anymore. "No, Emma, I'm not sure. I thought I was. I thought this was what I wanted. But I don't feel anything. I'm just going through the motions, and I'm scared that if I marry him, I'll never be able to be true to myself." Emma didn't say anything at first. She just listened, her eyes full of understanding. She knew Julia had been struggling with this for a while, but hearing it out loud was a different experience. "You don't have to do this, Jules. If you're not happy, then maybe it's time to be honest with yourself and everyone else." Julia nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. She didn't know what the future held, but at least she was being true to herself. The decision was not easy. The next few days were filled with difficult conversations, tearful apologies, and a lot of uncertainty. Henry, devastated by Julia's admission, couldn't understand why she was walking away from everything they had built together. He couldn't fathom why she would reject a life filled with luxury and security for something that seemed so uncertain. But Julia knew, deep down, that it wasn't about the wealth or the status. It was about finding her happiness, something that didn't come with a price tag or a lavish party. She had to make the choice that was right for her, no matter how difficult it was. As the weeks passed, Julia found herself rediscovering the things that made her truly happy. She spent more time with her family, reconnected with old friends, and focused on building a life that felt authentic. She wasn't sure what her future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt free. The morning of Julia's wedding arrived, and the world seemed to come alive in a dreamlike haze. The sky was painted with hues of pink and orange as the sun rose, casting its warm glow on the elaborate preparations happening all around her. The grand ballroom had been transformed into an ethereal vision, with delicate floral arrangements, cascading chandeliers, and the soft melodies of a string quartet filling the air. Every detail had been meticulously planned to perfection. The dress, the venue, the guest list, everything was set for what was supposed to be the most magical day of Julia's life. But as she gazed at herself in the mirror, dressed in the pristine white gown that had cost more than most people's entire weddings, she couldn't shake the growing sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. For months, she had told herself this was the right decision. Henry was the perfect match for her, a man who could provide for her, a man who represented everything she thought she wanted. But as she stood there, staring at her reflection, she felt a cold emptiness creeping in. Was this really what she wanted? Was this the life she had imagined for herself? Or had she been so blinded by the idea of perfection, of societal expectations, that she had convinced herself this was her happily ever after? As Julia's mind spiraled, her heart beat faster. She remembered the first time she had met Henry. Back then, everything had seemed so simple. He was charming, successful, and the type of man her parents had always hoped she'd end up with. He was kind, handsome, and had all the qualities that anyone would consider ideal in a husband. But now, standing on the precipice of one of the most important moments of her life, Julia wasn't sure she could ignore the nagging doubts any longer. The perfect fairy tale she had once imagined felt increasingly distant, as though it was slipping away with every step closer she took to the altar. Her bridal party had gathered around her, each of them marveling at how beautiful she looked. But all Julia could think about was the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to follow her wherever she went. As she took a deep breath and prepared herself to walk down the aisle, she caught a glimpse of her fiancé, Henry, standing at the altar. He looked every bit the part of the perfect groom, handsome, confident, and beaming with happiness. The guests began to take their seats, their eyes on her, and the music swelled. But Julia felt like she was walking toward something that wasn't her future. As her father took her arm and led her toward the altar, every step felt heavier than the last. She tried to smile, tried to feel the excitement she was supposed to feel. But the closer she got to Henry, the further away she felt from herself. Her mind wandered to the years that had led to this moment. How had she gotten here? How had she gone from a girl who dreamed of passion and excitement to a woman about to marry for security and convenience? The ceremony began, and Julia's heart raced as she heard the officiant's words. She nodded at the right moments, repeated the vows that had been written for her, and smiled when expected. But all she could think about was the weight of her decision. Was she making the right choice? Was she about to marry a man she could spend the rest of her life with? Or was she about to make a mistake she would regret forever? When it came time to exchange rings, Henry took her hand in his, and for a brief moment, Julia felt a fleeting sense of warmth. He squeezed her hand gently, as though to reassure her, but the moment passed quickly, leaving only a cold void in its wake. The guests were smiling, their eyes shining with joy as they watched the couple exchange vows. The photographer captured the perfect moments, Julia's radiant smile, Henry's adoring gaze. The cameras flashed, the guests clapped, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. But inside, Julia was falling apart. She felt as though she were playing a role in someone else's story, not her own. As the ceremony continued, Julia's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden image of someone from her past. A face she hadn't seen in years. It was him. The man she had once rejected. The man who had once been her everything. The man who had always loved her more than she had ever loved him. The man she had turned away for the sake of ambition. The man who had once promised her that he would become someone worthy of her love. And now, here he was, standing among the guests, watching her marry Henry. For a split second, Julia's heart stopped. She tried to push the thought aside, but the feeling lingered, and she could sense the tension in the air. Henry was still smiling, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. She felt guilty for even considering the possibility that her mind was still drawn to the man who had once been the love of her life. But the truth was, deep down, she knew that she had never truly let him go. As the ceremony reached its climax, the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the crowd erupted into applause. Julia's smile felt forced as she turned to face Henry, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had just married a man who represented everything she thought she wanted, but in her heart, she knew she had left something important behind, something she couldn't replace. As the reception began, the guests mingled and celebrated, toasting the happy couple and offering their congratulations. Julia moved through the crowd like a ghost, her thoughts consumed by the man who had once meant everything to her. She could see him out of the corner of her eye, standing by the bar, his gaze locked on her. Julia's heart raced, and she felt a mixture of guilt, longing, and regret. Was this the life she had chosen? Was this the life she was meant to lead? As the night wore on, Julia couldn't help but wonder if the fairy tale she had imagined for so long was just that, a fantasy. The lavish wedding, the perfect dress, the extravagant reception, they were all just outward signs of something deeper, something missing. And as she danced with her new husband, Julia couldn't escape the truth that lingered in her heart. She had married for all the wrong reasons, and no matter how beautiful the wedding day seemed on the outside, inside, Julia knew that her journey was far from over. The night was young, but the questions that had been nagging at her for so long remained unanswered. Would she be able to live the life she had chosen? Or had she made a mistake that would haunt her forever? The night of the wedding reception, just as the guests were settling into their conversations and enjoying the lavish surroundings, the sound of a private jet approaching caught everyone's attention. The distinct hum of its engines reverberated through the air, quickly becoming the center of curiosity. Julia, her mind still caught in a whirlwind of emotions, glanced toward the grand entrance. She felt an inexplicable tug at her heart, a feeling she couldn't quite place. She had no idea who could be arriving now, especially at such a late hour. As the jet touched down, the curiosity of the crowd grew, and whispers began to ripple through the guests. Who could be arriving in such style? It wasn't long before a sleek black limousine pulled up, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of who was inside. The door opened, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out. His confident stride was unmistakable, and as he made his way toward the reception hall, Julia's heart skipped a beat. She could see the crowd parting for him, and every eye was now focused on this mystery man, who seemed to demand attention. And then it happened. He looked up, and his eyes locked onto hers. Julia froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from her past, the one she had rejected so harshly all those years ago. The man who had promised to make something of himself, the man who had silently vowed that he would return when he had proven his worth. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, his presence filling the room in a way that no one else could. The guests were buzzing, but Julia was silent, her heart racing as memories of their past together flooded back. She remembered how she had turned him away, how she had told him he wasn't good enough for her back then. She had chosen comfort and security over love, choosing a path that had led her here. Yet, seeing him now, she felt a rush of emotions she couldn't control. The man she had rejected had come back in a way that she could never have anticipated. He wasn't the same man she had turned away. The private jet, the perfectly tailored suit, the confidence in his every step. He was no longer the man she had left behind. He had transformed into someone powerful, someone successful, someone who had made his dreams a reality. As he moved through the crowd, every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. The guests, who had once looked at him with indifference, now watched him with awe. Julia's eyes followed him as he made his way toward her. She felt as though the room had suddenly shrunk, leaving only the two of them standing in the center of it. The whispers from the guests grew louder, but she could barely hear them over the pounding of her own heart. The realization hit her like a wave. He had come back to prove something. He wasn't here to pick up where they had left off. No. He was here to show her how wrong she had been, how mistaken she had been to walk away from him. The moment their eyes locked, time seemed to slow. Julia's mind raced as she remembered the way he had looked at her all those years ago. The love, the devotion, the vulnerability. Now she saw the strength in his eyes, the resolve, and something else. Revenge. She could see it in the way his lips curled into a confident smile, the kind of smile that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and where he stood now. The man she had rejected was no longer someone she could ignore. He was someone she couldn't simply brush aside. Julia felt a sting of regret. Had she truly made the right choice? Her life with Henry, despite the wealth and comfort, suddenly felt empty. Her heart ached as she watched the man approach her, his gaze never leaving hers. It wasn't just his success that had changed. It was the way he carried himself now, the way he moved through the room with ease, as if he belonged here, in this world of wealth and privilege. She, on the other hand, felt out of place, disconnected from the very world she had worked so hard to build. When he reached her, there was a brief moment of silence. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. He took a step closer to her, and for a moment, Julia thought she might collapse under the weight of everything that had transpired. The words she wanted to say were caught in her throat. He had come to prove something, and in doing so, he had exposed her greatest fear, that she had made the wrong choice all those years ago. He had won. But there was no time to dwell on it. Henry, noticing the tension between them, stepped in. He put his arm around Julia, a protective gesture that seemed to carry an unspoken message. The man who had once been nothing to her was now standing in front of her, an undeniable force she couldn't ignore. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more apparent. Henry, who had given her everything she thought she wanted, and the man who had walked away, only to return stronger and more successful than ever. As the music continued to play, Julia found herself lost in a whirlwind of emotions. The jet, the private entrance, his transformation. It all symbolized how much he had changed, how much she had underestimated him. He was no longer the man she had rejected. He was someone who had rewritten his own story, someone who now stood in front of her as the embodiment of everything she had once dismissed. Julia's heart pounded as she stood there, caught between two worlds, the one she had built with Henry and the one she had left behind with him. She wasn't sure which path to follow anymore. But one thing was clear. The man who had once been her everything was no longer a distant memory. He was here, in the present, showing her the life she could have had, and forcing her to confront the truth of her past choices. This grand entrance, in a private jet no less, was more than just a dramatic moment. It was a symbol of transformation, of redemption, and of everything Julia had lost. The night was supposed to be one of celebration, a culmination of years of planning and preparation for Julia's wedding. The guests were still buzzing from the grand entrance of her former lover, the man she had once rejected. He had walked into her life like a storm, challenging everything she thought she knew about love, success, and happiness. But now, as the night stretched on, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Julia couldn't ignore the way he had looked at her, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through her, making her feel as if her very soul was laid bare. She had tried to push him out of her mind, to focus on the future with Henry. But it was impossible. She couldn't shake the feeling that the past was coming back to haunt her. As the reception continued, Julia felt a strange pull to leave the grand ballroom. She excused herself quietly from the crowd, making her way toward the back of the venue, where the moonlight filtered through the windows. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that she hoped to find some peace. But when she reached the terrace, she found him standing there, waiting for her. His presence was like an electric shock, sending a ripple of tension through her body. "Julia," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight she hadn't heard in years. "We need to talk." There was no escaping the conversation now. His words, laced with emotion and a hint of something darker, made it clear that this moment was unavoidable. Julia's heart raced as she turned to face him. The man she had once rejected, the man who had walked away in silence, had returned, and he wasn't the same. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fade into the background, and all that was left was the undeniable chemistry between them. Julia felt the familiar pull toward him, the attraction she had never truly let go of, but she also felt a deep sense of guilt. Her heart was torn between the man standing in front of her and the life she had built with Henry. He broke the silence first. "I've waited a long time for this moment. I told myself I'd walk away, that I wouldn't look back, but I was wrong. I came here tonight to confront you, to make you see what you did to me." Julia flinched at his words, but there was no denying the truth in them. She had rejected him years ago, and in doing so, she had shattered his world. She had chosen security, comfort, and a life of ease, while he had been left to pick up the pieces of his shattered heart. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was young, and I thought I knew what was best for me." "But you didn't," he replied, his voice cold, but with an undercurrent of sadness. "You rejected me because I wasn't good enough for you, because you thought you deserved more. But here's the thing, Julia," he said, stepping closer to her. "I'm not the same man anymore. I built my life from nothing, and now I have everything I ever wanted, and more. And you're still here, clinging to a life that doesn't make you happy." His words hit her like a slap in the face. He was right. She had spent so many years chasing a dream that didn't belong to her, trying to fill a void that only love could fill. And now, as she stood here, faced with the man who had once been her everything, she realized just how much she had lost. "I don't want your money," he continued, his voice softer now, almost tender. "I don't need it. But I do need you to understand what you did to me, to see that your choices have consequences. Have consequences." Julia felt her throat tighten, her chest aching with the weight of his words. She had never truly understood the depth of his pain. She had never fully grasped what it meant to walk away from someone who loved her, to break his heart and leave him to pick up the pieces. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know what I was doing." He looked at her, his eyes filled with both pain and understanding. "I know you didn't. But that doesn't change what happened." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their past. Julia could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent so many years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she had made the right choice. But now, standing here, faced with the man she had once loved, she couldn't deny the truth any longer. "You've changed," she said, her voice filled with awe and regret. "You're not the same man I left behind." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Neither are you." The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unsaid words and unacknowledged feelings. Julia knew that this confrontation wasn't just about the past. It was about the choices they had both made and the lives they had built in the years since. "I didn't come here to destroy your wedding," he said, his voice steady. "I didn't come here to make you regret your choices, but I couldn't stand by and watch you walk into a future that you don't truly want." She felt the sting of his words, but deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent so many years convincing herself that her life with Henry was everything she wanted, but now, with him standing here, she realized how much of herself she had left behind. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix what I've done." "You can't undo the past," he replied, "but you can learn from it. You can choose to move forward with honesty and clarity, or you can continue to live a lie." His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Julia knew that the moment had come. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The choices she had made, the mistakes she had made, they were all laid bare before her. And now, she had to decide what kind of future she wanted to create. At that moment, Julia realized that this confrontation wasn't just about the man standing in front of her. It was about herself. It was about her growth, her journey. And as painful as it was, she knew that this moment was the catalyst for everything that would come next. As they stood there, under the moonlight, Julia made a vow to herself. She would no longer run from her past. She would face it, embrace it, and use it to shape the future she truly desired. But whether that future would include him, only time would tell. The wedding reception was in full swing, the guests celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day of Julia's life. Yet, her mind was far from the joyous atmosphere. As the evening continued, every smile, every toast, every congratulatory word felt like a reminder of the one thing she couldn't stop thinking about. The man who had left her life years ago, only to return in the most unexpected of ways. Julia had spent the last few years convincing herself that her life with Henry was what she truly wanted. She had buried the regret of letting go of her first love. But deep down, she knew it was always there. Now, as she stood next to the man she was about to marry, it was impossible to ignore the emptiness that weighed on her heart. She had made a choice once, but had it been the right one? As Henry took her hand and led her to the dance floor, Julia tried to push the doubts aside. She was the bride. She was supposed to be happy, but the memories of her past flooded her mind. Memories of a man she had once rejected, only to watch him grow into someone she couldn't recognize. The success he had achieved, the wealth he had amassed, the man he had become, all of it only served to highlight the choice she had made years ago. The moment she saw him again, standing in front of her wedding with all his success and power, it hit her like a tidal wave. She had spent years trying to forget, trying to move on, but it was all coming back now. The regret was overwhelming, and Julia couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to change anything. After the dance, Julia excused herself from the reception, her heart heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake that had led her down a path of emptiness. She wandered into the quiet halls of the venue, away from the laughter and music, trying to sort through her tangled emotions. She knew she had to confront what was happening inside her before it consumed her. As she sat in a private corner, alone with her thoughts, she replayed the events of the past in her mind. She thought back to the man she had once loved, the man who had proposed to her with nothing but hope in his eyes. And she thought about her decision to walk away, thinking she could do better, that there was something more for her out there. But now, as she looked at her life, she couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of regret. She had made her choice, but did that mean she had to live with it forever? Was it too late for her to go back, to right the wrongs of the past? The truth was, Julia had always believed she could control her future. She thought that with enough money, status, and success, she could fill the void in her life. But now, standing at the crossroads of her past and present, she realized how wrong she had been. The happiness she had sought in the wrong places had never been enough. And the man she had left behind, he had never been just another option. He had been the love of her life, the one who had truly understood her. Julia's thoughts were interrupted when a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see him standing there, the man who had been her everything. The man who had returned not for revenge, but for closure. The man who had left, but had never truly forgotten her. "Julia," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to talk." The words hit her like a shock to the system. She had thought she had been avoiding this conversation, but now it seemed inevitable. It was now or never. The regret that had been building inside her for years surged to the surface, and she could no longer deny it. "I don't want to do this," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "I've made my choice. I'm getting married, and I need to move on." But the man who had once loved her didn't back down. "You can't keep running from this, Julia. You made your decision back then, but now you're facing the consequences. You can't just erase the past, no matter how hard you try. The confrontation felt like a gut punch, but it was also the wake-up call she needed. He was right. She couldn't just pretend that everything was fine. She couldn't ignore the fact that her heart was still tied to him, that she had never truly let go. The regret that had been building for so long was now impossible to ignore. "I never meant to hurt you," Julia whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was." He looked at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know, Julia. You weren't the only one who made a mistake. But that doesn't change what happened." The silence between them was heavy, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air. Julia knew that she couldn't undo the past. She couldn't go back in time and make different choices. But now, standing here, facing the man who had once been everything to her, she realized that regret could either destroy her or propel her toward the future she truly wanted. "I don't know what to do anymore," Julia admitted, her voice breaking. "I feel like I'm trapped between two worlds." The man stepped closer, his gaze softening. "You don't have to decide right now, but whatever you choose, you need to choose it with your heart, not your head. Don't let the fear of what might happen stop you from living the life you deserve." His words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, Julia felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't too late. She still had the power to change her life, to follow her heart, and to stop living a lie. The decision was hers, and though the weight of her regret would never fully go away, she knew she had the strength to make the right choice for her future. As the night wore on, Julia made a silent vow to herself. No matter what happened next, she would no longer let her past dictate her future. She would face her regrets head-on, and with courage, she would make the choice that would lead her to true happiness. Julia had always believed in second chances, but now, standing face to face with the man she had once loved, she couldn't help but wonder if those chances were truly worth it. The man who had once been her everything, the man she had rejected all those years ago, was standing before her. But he was different. The man she saw now wasn't the same one she had once known. Time had changed him in ways she couldn't have imagined, and it left her questioning whether a second chance could even be possible. As she stood there, her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but she couldn't bring herself to ask him anything. She had let him go once, and now she was faced with the reality of what her choice had cost her. Years had passed, and so much had changed, not just in his life, but in hers as well. They were no longer the same people, and Julia knew that getting back together wouldn't be as simple as picking up where they left off. Too much had happened. Too many wounds had been inflicted, and the past was far too complicated to erase with a single conversation. But there was something about his presence, something about the way he looked at her now, that made her wonder if she could still find a way back to him. Her heart ached as memories flooded back. The way he had held her, the way he had promised her a future, the way they had once talked about building a life together. She had never truly forgotten him, even though she had tried to convince herself otherwise. But now that he was here, standing in front of her, all those feelings resurfaced. Could she walk away from him again? Or was there still a chance to make things right? He had changed. That much was clear. The man she had once known was gone. The confident, successful man standing before her was a stranger in many ways. Someone who had built a life without her. Someone who had moved on. He wasn't the young man she had rejected anymore. He was powerful, accomplished, and had achieved everything she had once believed he couldn't. And yet, despite all his success, there was something in his eyes, a sadness, a vulnerability, that made Julia wonder if he still harbored feelings for her. Had he ever truly let go of her? Julia's heart ached as she considered the possibility of a second chance, but she wasn't sure she was ready to face the consequences of what that would mean. She had chosen Henry, the man she was engaged to, the man who had been by her side for years, And yet, here she was, torn between the man of her past and the life she had built with someone else. The emotional conflict raged inside her, and she couldn't find the answers she needed. As they sat down together in a quiet corner, the tension between them was palpable. The years apart had created a distance that was hard to bridge, but the longing they both felt for each other was undeniable. Julia could see the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the same way they had all those years ago, when they had been so deeply in love. And yet, she knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. Too much had changed, and the person she was now was no longer the same person she had been then. She had grown, just as he had. "I never expected to see you here," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I thought I had lost you forever." He smiled faintly, but it was a bittersweet smile. "I never thought I'd be back either. But here we are. And I have to admit, seeing you again brings back so many memories. Memories I've tried to forget, but never could." Julia looked down, feeling the weight of his words. "I'm sorry for what happened between us," she whispered. "I made a mistake. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I don't know anymore." He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "You don't have to apologize, Julia. I know why you left. But I've changed. I'm not the same man I was back then. And I'm not sure if we can just pick up where we left off. Too much has happened, and we've both lived different lives since then." Tears welled up in Julia's eyes as she nodded. She knew he was right. They couldn't just pretend that everything was the same. They had both changed too much. The life they had once dreamed of seemed so far away now, like a distant memory. She had moved on, built a life with someone else, and now he was a stranger to her in many ways. "I don't know if I can go back," Julia admitted, her voice breaking. "I've built my life around the choices I've made, and I can't just undo everything." He squeezed her hand gently, his expression softening. "I understand. And I'm not asking you to. But I want you to know something. I don't regret what happened. I don't regret the path I took because it led me to who I am today. And who I am today is a man who still cares about you. I don't know if there's a place for us in each other's lives anymore, but I wanted you to know that I'm not the same man you turned away from. I'm not the man you thought I was." Julia looked into his eyes, searching for the man she had once known. She saw a glimmer of the man she had loved, but there was also a new depth to him, a confidence and strength that hadn't been there before. He had become someone she could admire, even though she knew their paths had diverged so much. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "But maybe there's a chance for us to be something again. But I can't promise anything." He nodded, his face expressionless but understanding. "I don't expect you to. All I can do is offer you the truth of who I am now. Whether or not that's enough for you is something only you can decide." The silence between them was filled with the weight of all they had shared, all they had lost, and all that could have been. Julia knew that she was at a crossroads in her life, facing a choice that could change everything. But could she truly move forward with him? Or had time and circumstances forever changed what they once had? As the conversation drew to a close, Julia stood up, her heart torn between the past and the future. She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life was far from simple, and the choice she faced now was more complicated than ever before. Would she choose the man who had loved her? The man who had transformed into something greater than she had ever imagined? Or would she stay with the life she had built and try to forget the man she had once rejected? The decision, she knew, would change everything. The weight of the decision hung in the air between them, a silence that spoke volumes. Julia could feel the heaviness of the moment in her chest, her heart racing as she awaited his response. He had come so far, changed so much, and had fought through his own struggles. all while keeping her in his thoughts. But now, with everything laid bare, the question was whether he would forgive her for the past and let it go, or if he would walk away, leaving everything behind. The man standing before her was no longer the one she had turned away from all those years ago. He had become someone she admired, someone she couldn't recognize entirely but longed to understand. She had hurt him, rejected him, and in the process, shattered the future they could have had together. Yet, here he was, standing before her, with a choice to make. Could he forgive her for her past mistakes? Or was too much broken to mend? Was the love they had enough to overcome the damage done? Or was it now just a shadow of something that could never be again? He stood across from her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions, hurt, anger, and a deeper pain she had never truly understood. Julia had always been the one to walk away, to make decisions based on what she thought was right. But now she realized, the power was no longer in her hands. It was his choice. He had to decide whether he could forgive her for everything, the rejection, the lies, the way she had left him behind when he needed her most. Could he find it in his heart to let go of the past and allow her back into his life? Or would he choose to walk away, taking all his pain with him and leaving her with nothing but the memory of what could have been? She reached out to him, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to make up for the years I've taken from you. But I want to try. I want to make things right, no matter what it takes." His gaze softened for a moment, and for a split second, Julia thought she saw the old man she had once loved in his eyes. The man she had pushed away. The man who had meant everything to her. But then the moment passed, and the weight of everything between them settled back into place. He was a different person now, and so was she. They couldn't pretend that things were the same, but there was still a flicker of hope in her chest that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what they had lost. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he considered his next words. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "You broke me. You walked away without a second thought, and I had to rebuild my entire life from the ground up. But I'm not the same man I was before. I've learned a lot since then. And I've learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about letting go of the past, for your own sake. But that doesn't mean it's easy. It's not something I can just decide in a moment." Julia's heart sank as she listened to him. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, that this moment was the culmination of years of hurt and pain. But she also knew that she couldn't give up without trying. She had made mistakes, but she wasn't the same woman who had turned her back on him. She had grown, and she wanted him to see that. She wanted him to see that the love she had for him had never died, even if she had tried to convince herself otherwise. "I know I've hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I've spent years thinking about you, regretting the choices I made. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make it right. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, we can start over. We can build something together, something real, something that lasts." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of sincerity. And for a moment, Julia thought he might walk away, that the damage was just too deep. But then he stepped closer to her, his hand gently brushing against hers. His eyes softened, and she saw the flicker of the man she had once loved. He was still there, buried beneath the pain and the years of distance. "You hurt me more than I ever thought possible," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion. "But I've spent years asking myself if I could ever forgive you. I've moved on, built a life without you, and I've learned to be strong on my own. But the truth is, I've never stopped loving you. I've never truly let you go, even though I tried. And now, I'm standing here, asking myself if I'm strong enough to forgive you, and take the risk of loving you again." Julia's heart raced as she listened to him, her pulse quickening with hope. This wasn't over. There was still a chance for them, still a chance to rebuild what had been broken. But it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, effort, and a willingness to confront the ghosts of their past. Could they both forgive each other for everything they had done? Could they rebuild their relationship, even after all these years? Julia didn't know the answers, but she knew she was willing to try. "I don't want to live with regret anymore," she said, her voice steady now. "I don't want to wonder what could have been. I want to make things right with you, no matter how hard it is. I'm ready to fight for us." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes intense as he weighed her words. The decision was his. It was always going to be his. Would he forgive her and take the leap of faith? Or would he walk away and leave everything behind? The silence between them stretched, but Julia could feel the tension begin to ease. She knew they couldn't just move on from the past, but they could face it together. They could work through the pain, the mistakes, and the hurt. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not promising it will be easy. I'm not promising that we'll forget everything. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take the chance. Because I believe in us. I believe that we can build something new, something better than what we had before." Julia's heart swelled with emotion as she heard his words. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was filled with hope, love, and the possibility of a future together. As they stood there, holding on to each other, the weight of the past slowly began to lift. They had faced their demons, and now they had a chance to move forward. Together. As the dust settles after the emotional confrontation, both of them stand on the precipice of a new chapter. The air is thick with tension, but also with hope. After years of heartbreak, rejection, and self-discovery, they now face the ultimate choice. Will they take a chance on each other, risking everything for the possibility of a new beginning? Or will they turn away, leaving behind a lifetime of what-ifs, never truly knowing what could have been? Both of them have changed. The man she had once rejected has grown into someone more successful, more confident, more self-assured. The woman who had pushed him away now faces the reality of her choices and the consequences they have brought. She spent years with regrets, but she knows that the future she wants hinges on one decision. Can she let go of her past mistakes and trust that a future with him is worth the risk? And he, too, is at a crossroads. Though his heart still carries the scars of their past, he is now in control of his own life. He's successful, confident, and has the world at his feet. But is he willing to risk everything for a second chance with her? Can he truly forgive and build a life together? Or will the wounds of the past be too deep to heal? The stakes are high. The choices they make now will shape the rest of their lives. But the question remains: will it be a new beginning, or a lifetime of regret? They both know the answer won't come easily. With every passing moment, the pressure mounts. Julia watches him, seeing the man who has grown beyond her wildest imagination. He is not the same person she once knew. He has changed, just as she has. But can the love they once shared survive the weight of their past? She questions whether it's even possible to rebuild something so fragile, knowing that forgiveness is a two-way street. As he watches her, there is a battle within him too. He wants to believe in a future together. He wants to forgive, to let go of the past. But every step forward feels like a step into the unknown. Will his heart truly open again? Or will he always hold on to the bitterness of what she took from him? With each glance, each touch, they are reminded of the history that binds them, the laughter, the love, the shared dreams, but also the pain, the rejection, the silence that followed. It's not just about love. It's about trust, forgiveness, and the courage to face the unknown together. Both of them must decide. Will they walk away from the one chance they have left? Or will they embrace the possibility of a future that promises both happiness and pain? It's a terrifying choice, but one they must make. For Julia, the stakes are even higher. Her fear of regret is almost suffocating. She wonders if she will spend the rest of her life looking back at this moment, wishing she had made a different choice. Will she always wonder what could have been? Or will she have the strength to leap, to choose him and the future that could be theirs? He too has his doubts. The fear of getting hurt again is ever present. What if history repeats itself? What if, despite everything, they fall apart once more? He knows he can't live in fear forever, but the scars of the past still linger, making every decision a heavy one. He has already come so far, and the thought of risking it all for a woman who had rejected him so brutally is daunting. But something within him still wants to believe, still wants to give her the chance to prove that she is the woman he once thought she could be. As they stand at the crossroads, their eyes meet, and in that moment, everything is clear. There is no perfect solution, no guarantee of a happily ever after. But there is the chance for growth, for healing, and for a love that might finally have the foundation it needs to last. It's not about forgetting the past. It's about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward together. They have the chance to write a new chapter, one where they are both willing to risk everything for a future they can build together. But will they take it? The choice is theirs. And in this defining moment, they must decide if they are ready to face the future with each other, or if they will walk away, forever wondering what could have been. As the story reaches its final turning point, the tension between the two leads is palpable. The emotional roller coaster, the years of regret, and the rekindled feelings all come crashing down to this moment. She's standing at a crossroads, facing the man she once rejected, wondering whether to take the risk of starting anew with him or walking away to avoid more pain. He too is in the same place, ready to forgive, but struggling to fully let go of the past. Now, the story shifts from the fictional world of these characters to the real world of the viewers. This is the pivotal moment where the audience is called upon to reflect, to place themselves in the shoes of the woman, and to ask themselves, what would I do in her place? The call to action isn't just about watching the story unfold, it's about engaging with it emotionally and personally. The story has posed several important questions for the viewers, and now it's time to explore what they would do in such a high-stakes situation. The woman has to decide whether she's brave enough to take the leap and forgive herself, risk her heart again, and embrace the future with someone who may not have been in her life in the way she initially wanted. She's been through so much: loss, rejection, and now the chance for redemption. Would you be able to take that risk, knowing that your past mistakes might come back to haunt you? But it's not just about forgiveness. It's about trust. Would you trust someone who had once hurt you, even if that hurt came from a place of insecurity or fear? Could you set aside your ego and your pride to rebuild a relationship that was torn apart by past decisions? Would you put your trust in the one person who holds the power to make you feel whole again? For the viewers, the question is personal. They're asked to consider their relationships, their regrets, and their own decisions. Could they find the strength to move past their ego and mistakes? Would they be able to forgive the person who rejected them or hurt them? It's a chance to reflect on what truly matters in relationships: love, trust, vulnerability, and the courage to face the unknown together. By engaging with this question, the audience is invited to step beyond just being spectators of the story. They are challenged to think deeply about their own lives, their own choices, and the relationships that have shaped them. What would they do if they were the woman in this story? Would they risk it all for love, knowing that it's not always easy or certain? Or would they choose the safety of their past, letting the opportunity slip through their fingers and forever wonder what could have been? This final call to action brings the story full circle. It transforms the fictional world into a real-world reflection, prompting viewers to connect with the characters in a deeper, more personal way. It's not just about the ending of a story, it's about inviting the audience to engage in their journey of self-reflection and growth.